This is FE Peer Review. The date is September the 4th, 2021. Does angular size change due to an object's position with respect to the horizon? This video is addressed primarily at Gary Wybenga based on a conversation he and I had today, an exchange of comments, which is still ongoing, and he needs to do his part. This is to clarify some questions I asked him, but you all might find it interesting or might not. The comments came about because of a video by Critical Think, another great video by Critical Think. I highly recommend his channel if you haven't already checked it out. I left a comment on Critical Think's video. Yes, infinite compression that occurs right at the horizon line, yada yada. Doesn't matter what I said. You can pause this and read it if you want. Gary Wybenga responded, "It's no different than a car driving away from you. The tires will become completely unresolvable before the top of the car does. That is angular compression and the Rayleigh criteria effect, both in the bottom of the boat and in the bottom of the car." I responded to Gary with a question posing the problem rather than a car, posing the problem as a building. And I posed two questions. And the following part of this video is simply diagramming out those questions for the benefit of Gary so that we can really look carefully at what happens to angular size with respect to the observer, the horizon, and the object. So there's a 1 and a 2, and you can read them if you like. I asked this question to Gary. He responded, "Do you agree that the space between the bumper of a car and the road will have too small and of an angular size to resolve the tires after a certain distance while still being able to see the top of the car? If you answer this, I'll answer that." I want to emphasize this. Gary Wybenga made a promise. If you answer this, I'll answer that, he said. So my next comment, I answered him. And if you guys want to read my answer, you're welcome to. It's not particularly important. I will move on. So after I answered him, did he answer my questions? No, he did not. He continued talking about the car and angular compression and Rayleigh criteria. Same with boats, same with the bottoms of anything moving away from the observer. I responded, "Gary, I still disagree, yada, yada, yada. Now, are you going to answer my questions as you promised?" Gary's next comment came a short time later. "You're still wrong. The reason you can't see the tires is because there's not enough angular separation between the bumper and the road to resolve the tire between them. The same thing happens with boats or anything else." Nothing about the questions I asked Gary, which I might point out, I asked first before he asked me his question. And despite him asking me second, I agreed to answer first. And I'm still waiting for Gary to answer my questions. Are you going to answer my questions as you promised? Loads of online resources about Rayleigh Criterion, but I'm not going to talk about this anymore until you answer my questions as you said you would. Gary, I'm going to make a very brief video with diagrams to clarify my two questions so that you can be sure to understand exactly what I was asking. So here are those diagrams. So here are the two diagrams to go with the two questions I asked Gary. This is the first diagram. We have a 20-story building here. I've alternated the colors of each floor so that each floor is very easily visible. We've got a flat road going off in the distance, and there's a little red fellow here who's half the height of a story, about 6 feet high, little guy there. And he's looking up at this building, and he looks at the ground floor, and it takes up a certain angular size, and I've also dimensioned that here. Now, the actual numbers, I didn't try to draw this to any particular scale, but it's the proportions that count. And he also takes a look up at the top floor. Now, the top floor and the bottom floor are actually physically the same size, but when he looks at the bottom floor, he sees a larger surface compared to when he looks at the top floor. He sees 3.8 degrees. Here he sees 1.5 degrees. Proportional, you see the same here. Now that guy moves away from the building, comes out down the road, and he looks back at the same bottom floor and the same top floor. And the angular size and the amount of area that he's actually seeing are almost the same for both floors. They're not quite the same, but they're very close to the same now. So when he moves away, the difference between the top floor and the bottom floor gets less and less. So the angular sizes of the top floor and the bottom floor come closer and closer to being the same. That's when he's down there close to the ground looking at the bottom floor. In the next diagram, I've got the guy up here at the mid-height of the building. He's right there halfway up the building, looking at the 20 stories and looking at the top floor and looking at the bottom floor. He's now halfway between them. He sees them as the same size, both in terms of angular size and in terms of actual surface area. And when he moves off into the distance, further away, and looks back at that same first and 20th floor of that building, he still sees them as the same angular size. So the angular size or the resolution does not change with distance in this case. They remain the same. They started out the same and they remain the same. In the first example, they started out quite different when he was up close, but the further away he gets, the closer they become to the same in angular size. So if this guy were to go out so far that the Rayleigh criterion would start kicking in terms of angular size, assuming he has not gone so far that the radius of the Earth is causing issues with what he can see, in other words, blocking the bottom of the building. If you went out far enough, the angular size all of these blocks are going to be approaching the same value, and they're all going to become, each one individually, unresolvable due to Rayleigh criterion at approximately the same distance, maybe exactly the same distance. I haven't done the math. So Gary, that's my question, and I have given you my interpretation of the answer. I need you to give me yours now. You promised you would. I am waiting for your response.